Section 3, and it's called War and Expansion in the United States. So we're going to talk about how the U.S. grew from just these 13 original colonies, coupled with some French and Spanish territory, into actually a powerful and great nation. First, I want to talk to you guys about Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny, it was this idea that just caught on as part of American culture in the early 1800s, that population pressure was actually generating a push factor for migration, that as cities on the East Coast were becoming crowded, as young people were discovering there was just a general lack of opportunity on the East Coast, people began to move westward. Well, what was west at that time? Not much. A handful of native villages, probably more bears than people. And what people found as we moved west was yes, Native American villages, but also land. And people began to move westward and further and further and further. And in 1804, as Napoleon was trying to conquer the world, a major French territory revolted against the French Empire. Now we call it the island of Haiti. It was a slave colony. The French were using these slaves to grow crops to generate revenue for the French Empire. And the slaves revolted and won their freedom and declared their independence and named the island Haiti. And Napoleon, as a result, just felt it wasn't worth trying to hang on to all of these French territories in the New World, especially when there was an emerging and growing nation of the United States right next door. He already had to fight a war in Europe. He was fighting a disastrous rebellion in Spain. He was about to launch a full-scale invasion of Russia. Really, what he needed was money. And so he agreed to sell the Louisiana Territory to Thomas Jefferson for $15 million. Sure, that's a chunk of money back then. But guys, we doubled the size of our country for $15 million. It's hard to imagine. It's the reason why the French Broad is called the French Broad. As it flows by Henderson County, it goes into Buncombe County, eventually into Madison County, and then, of course, what's it do? Cuts through the mountains and then dumps into Tennessee. Now, it's called the French Broad because by the time it enters Tennessee, it's no longer this small creek that you can jump across. It's a mile wide by the time you get to Tennessee. Yeah, this tiny little stream going through our county is a mile wide when it reaches the Holston River and then dumps into the Tennessee and then eventually the Gulf of Mexico. It's called the French Broad because that was all French territory. See, all the lands west of the Appalachians, east of the Mississippi, once belonged to the French. They sold it to us for $15 million because Napoleon really just needed the money to try to conquer the world. We got a pretty sweet deal, right? Destiny. And that is the idea, well, that it was our destiny, our God-given right even, to continue to expand until eventually we reached the West Coast. Now, when Jefferson had bought all of this land, he immediately realized he didn't know much about it. Very few people had even traveled in these territories aside from Native Americans. And so he commissioned Lewis and Clark to explore. And so they led a group of about 50 people. I'm sure you've heard the famous story. Sacagawea went with them, a Native American interpreter and guide. and it was a peaceful expedition, a scientific one, and they made it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The journey took them about 2 years. They explored as much as they could, and they brought back maps. They brought back information about the peoples that lived there. They had some incredible adventures and encounters along the way. But they came back, and they reported on what they found. And they reported that the land was theirs, that it could be taken, it could be settled. This is a land that could potentially support a large population. But of course, one of the ongoing, continuing conflicts was that the land was already occupied by native peoples. And as people continued to push into lands further and further west, including Henderson County, they also found that there were people already living here. And those people that were moving into this county actually wound up fighting with many of the natives who were living here. For example, if you ever drive 276 towards Waynesville, you cross over the Blue Ridge Mountains, you cross over the Parkway. As you're going into the community of East Fork, which is right there on the other side of the mountains, there are several historical markers of battles that settlers fought against the native peoples who were living here. Now, eventually, let's fast forward to our 7th president, Andrew Jackson. Eventually, those settlers have become so numerous in areas west of the Appalachians that settlers have now moved into Tennessee, have moved into Georgia, into Louisiana, and even beginning to move west of the Mississippi. And so Andrew Jackson claimed that it would just cost too much money to keep these Native American peoples safe. That settlers were just going to continue to do their thing, and there was going to be fights all the time. And so what he believed needed to happen was that the natives would need to move somewhere else. And so he pushed through Congress the Indian Removal Act, a very controversial law. And it required that all native peoples move out of the Southeast. And so with the exception of a few folks who hid in the mountains in what is today Cherokee, North Carolina, all other native peoples were forcibly relocated along the Trail of Tears and settled into what is today the state of Oklahoma. The Cherokee actually fought this in the United States Supreme Court in a case called Worcester versus Georgia, and they won. But the president refused to follow what the Supreme Court ordered, and these government leaders justified the horrible things they were doing to the natives based on this idea of manifest destiny. Meanwhile, not too many people were concerned about the plight of the natives. I have to admit, most people were thinking about this in very selfish terms. And so, as the United States extended its borders in the north all the way as far west and north as the Oregon territories, and then in the southern part of our country, Florida, from Spain, eventually Louisiana, continuing to move westward, both north and south. One of the main divisive issues that those people were facing, one of the main political issues, again, was not the plight of the Native Americans, unfortunately. It was not moral issues, but it was the issue of slavery, which certainly was a moral issue, but then was just simply deemed as a political one. But this issue of slavery is going to become the chief political debate of that time. For example, when the people of Texas, you see, when Mexico declared their independence from Spain, they also realized that much of their land was sparsely populated and in need of development. And so they had their own version of a Statue of Liberty. Mexico began to encourage people to move into, particularly their northern provinces, for example, the province of Texas. And so many Americans, again, with that population pressure, many folks began moving west. But many of these Americans that were moving into Mexican territory brought their slaves with them. Now, Mexico had one condition. They said, we invite you to come and live in our territories, and you can have the land, and you can live there, and you can settle, and you can keep it. One condition. You must agree to become Mexican citizens and obey our laws. And so, the Americans said, okay, sure, whatever. Sweet, free land. Great. And so tens of thousands of Americans began moving into Texas. But that one little condition. Oh yeah, by the way, Mexico outlawed slavery. In their original constitution, no slavery. But wait, these Americans began bringing slaves in with them. And so a Mexican government official approached the governor of Texas and said, you've got to tell your people that they've got to free these slaves or they've got to leave. This is a problem. And so Stephen Austin said, I can't do that. I can't tell these people to leave their slaves. And so they threw him in jail. They said, look, if you're not going to do your job, you either need to get out of here or we're going to throw you in jail. So Texas revolted and rebelled against Mexico's government, mainly because they wanted to keep their slaves. And they won their independence. They declared themselves a country, and then they joined with the United States as a slave state in 1845. Mexico was very upset about this, obviously. In fact, the United States took it a step further. And James K. Polk sent a couple of diplomats to Mexico to offer to buy the territories of New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Which, if you've ever driven out west, that is a lot of territory. And he was going to offer to buy it for $15 million. Guys, that's almost half of the territory of Mexico. He's going to offer to buy half their country, $15 million. Guess what they said? No. Right? I mean, are you going to sell off half your country for $15 million? No. So then what? Well, then Polk sent General Winfield Scott to the border of Texas to blockade the Rio Grande to provoke a fight. And you know what happened? There's a bar just south of the border in a town called Matamoros. And there was a fight there. And 12 American soldiers got killed in the fight. That's a heck of a bar fight. I don't know what happened. Again, all I know is that it was south of the border, and that's important because the president is actually going to go to Congress over this, and he's going to claim that the fight actually occurred on American soil because he's going to pound his fist on the table and shout, American blood on American soil. Now, bottom line, and you'll learn more about this in American history, the United States won this war in less than 6 months. We occupied Mexico City. We showed up then and said, we'll leave you guys alone, but we're keeping the lands of New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And here's your $15 million. And that's the end of the story with the U.S. war with Mexico. Once more, it's unfortunate that in the course of our history, we don't concern ourselves with these moral issues like the Native Americans, or like slavery, or like the plight of Mexico. What we concern ourselves with is our selfish interest. How does this affect me? And we never seem to learn that lesson. Because in thinking about slavery from a selfish point of view, how does this affect me? That led the North to seek to stop the spread of slavery because that affected their business interest. And that led the South to seek to extend slavery because that affected their business interest. You see, meanwhile, the North didn't use a slave-based labor system because they just had not evolved that way. But the South depended on the slave labor system because of the cash crops and plantations they had established. Mainly cotton, but also sugar, rice, tobacco. and other crops. And so this issue of slavery became a growing and divisive political issue. You see, as the country was moving westward, the chief question was not, what should we do about these natives? How should we treat the people of Mexico? The chief question was, should we allow people to bring their slaves into these territories? And again, it's unfortunate that we're not considering the moral implications here. Some were. There were Frederick Douglasses peacefully petitioning. There were Henry David Thoreaus arguing that slavery is moral evil. There were eventually Abraham Lincolns also saying slavery was a vast moral evil. But most people were thinking about this in terms of economics. How is this going to affect my business if California decides to abolish slavery? And so this also began to touch off a major fundamental issue with how our country is designed. You see, we are the United States of America. States, meaning the state of North Carolina, the state of South Carolina, the state of Texas. Each state makes its own rules. But there's also, we are the United. We are a nation. And so there are certain rules that supersede the state rules. And that's a very important thing to understand. Because you see, when the 13th Amendment was passed, ending slavery, that ended slavery for all of the states, no matter what they tried to do about it. And so many of these states, like South Carolina was leading the charge actually, began to claim, you can't tell us what to do. If you try to take away our slaves, we will leave the country. And I'm not talking about going to Canada. They will actually pull their state out of the country. And they threatened to do so many times until they finally did so in 1860. You see, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, he had been on record as saying slavery was evil. To him, it was evil. And he had been on record to say that there should be laws against it. And so when he was elected, South Carolina was the first to secede. To secede means they formally withdrew from the Union. And within a few months, 11 other states would follow suit. And this was the biggest rebellion the United States has ever dealt with. South fired the first shots at Fort Sumter, just off the coast of Charleston, and the United States Civil War began. In the end, the North defeated the South, and I'm sure you've heard the story, and you'll hear it in much more detail in American history, but at great cost. Of all the wars America has been involved with, if you total up all the casualties, they don't equal the amount of dead from this one war. We lost 556,000 American lives in the Civil War. But some very important changes came out as a result of this. Perhaps most importantly, slavery was put to an end. It would be formalized with the passage of the 13th Amendment, but during the war itself in 1863, Abraham Lincoln used his power of executive order. By decree of the president, slaves would be set free behind enemy lines. As the Union Army marched south, it would be a liberating force. And so as the Army freed slaves, they would continue to free slaves as they moved further south. Now, after the war was over, the 13th Amendment was passed, ending slavery, but also the 14th Amendment, declaring that former slaves would also be citizens, and the 15th Amendment granting African Americans the right to vote. When the war was over, it left a distasteful legacy. If you'll draw your attention to the image on the screen, I want you to understand that the South was not willing to treat former slaves as human beings. They did very terrible things to African Americans in the South. In fact, the Ku Klux Klan a terrorist group focused on restoring white supremacy in the South, was devoted to suppressing the black vote by any means necessary, as the photographs provide evidence of, dedicated to restoring a form of a plantation system and pushing out the influence of northern politicians. And they used terror tactics and were responsible for over 80,000 deaths between 1865 and 1900. And in the end, they won. Because in 1876, the Union, that is the North, pulled their troops out of the South. And the Klan dominated state politics at every level in southern states, mandating not only a suppression of the black vote, but also segregation, that is, separation of blacks and whites in the South. Meanwhile, millions of people were continuing to move into the country. By 1915, 20 million immigrants had arrived from Europe and Asia alone. Many of these moved west into the Midwest or even in the cities in the Northeast. And immigration has historically provided the workforce necessary to develop and industrialize our country. For example, the railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869. It was an ambitious project. Instead of having to walk or ride a horse across the country, you can now buy a ticket and ride a train. By 1900, there were 200,000 miles of rail track. Railroads allowed for shipment of freight at any time of the year, overland travel by simply buying a ticket, and this led to the industrial expansion and development of our country.